Howdy y'all, namaste. I thought I'd start out a little differently today. Today's Wednesday, March 9th, I think, and we're on spring break, and I'm just standing on my porch. Thought I'd show you a little glimpse of the farm here. So we own 9 acres here, 4 acres on that side of the street, including the pond and things, and then 5 acres on this side of the street with the barn and any kind of stuff. Anyway, I don't know why I started out this way. Maybe just to give you a little bit more flavor and context for what I'm about to do. Right now, I'm going to walk inside about 10 yards from this spot and record your review, exam review, but just kind of giving another overview of the first 2 units of the course and try and make sense of all this kind of stuff. Help you prepare for your midterm exam, but more importantly, help you prepare for the second half of the course and hopefully do some really groovy things in the second half, building on what we've consolidated, in the first half. Word. Namaste. Welcome back, y'all. Okay, so here's the reality. It's 2 o'clock right now, and my kids come home at 2:40. So whatever review I'm going to do as quickly as I can, try and cover as much information as I can, and give you a good basis for, like I said, for the exam, but also for the second half of the semester. So let's just think back over what we've done so far, right? So we've gone through the introduction and then 7 chapters, right? We had what's in it for me, what's in it for you, what's in it for me, what's in it, right? So we gave an overview in the introduction to the course. And then chapter 1, I called it overview, but I should have called it systematic philosophy, right? That's what we covered in there, is all these different pieces of the puzzle, ontology at the middle, and we'll go over that in a minute. Then we went into epistemology in chapter 2, right? What does knowledge stands on? What's the basis for what we know? And we also talked about in the second half of that chapter on various ways of knowing, right? Intellectual knowing, sensual knowing, rational knowing, imaginative knowing. Then in chapter 3, he gave you the phenomenological method, right? Talked about Husserl and Heidegger and how each one of them understood phenomenology and how we're practicing phenomenology and the importance of phenomenology in this course, right? Then chapter 4, we began doing philosophy and saying that philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. And then we went into that from there to talk about sex as a way of overcoming death in a certain kind of biological way, right? Intercourse as a way of continuing DNA, but also discourse, conversation, philosophical discourse with our neighbors and with one another that helps us to continue that intellectual, wisdom and pass that on from generation to generation as well. Then in chapter 5, we talked about the first principles of philosophy, right? So anthropology, cosmology, and existentialism, but then we began to call it theology for various reasons that then became apparent, hopefully, in that chapter. We'll come back to that. But also, why are these first principles unknowable, right? What is it why can't we answer those fundamental questions? And why can't knowledge have an anchor or a basis? But we also talked about with Kant, why philosophy needs an anchor. So an anchor is what anchors this course, right? If you're looking for something that helps everything to fit together, it's this anchor, right? The anchor is what anchors our conversation, our discourse. And epistemology is a search for some sort of anchor. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then chapter 6, we talked about logic, right? In order to have good discourse with one another, we need to use our words clearly and carefully so that other folks understand what's in our heads and vice versa. So we can understand what's in their heads, right? So we've got to engage in logical discourse and understand the limits of logic and rational knowing, which is inherently binary, right? And so we talked about zero and signifiers and the inherent paradox of a signifier, which brings something into being even as it intends just to signify it. So we talked about zero. We'll come back to that if we have time. And then it ended off with ontology, right? So if we want to use our words clearly, we've got to use all of our words clearly. And that begins by recognizing that very, very important word is, am, are, being, right? That very important word being in all of its various forms is a word that we use in a wide variety of ways, right? So we use it in terms of identity and form and function and temporality and also in terms of qualities. And we use it in other ways too, right? But it's important for our philosophical discourse if we're going to speak clearly and carefully so that our neighbor can understand what's in our mind, right? What appears to our phenomenological consciousness. or what appears as a phenomenon of our conscious mind, that we can articulate that to our neighbor in a way that our neighbor can understand. So we've got to use words clearly and carefully, which means we have to clearly define them in a rational manner. And then we did that in chapter 7, specifically on the word being or is or am, and the various ways that we could use that, right? Okay, so that's a really super fast, 4-minute review of everything that we did, but that's covering everything that we've done so far, right? And hopefully helping you to see how the bigger picture, right? And let's go into a little bit more detail. And I want to start this time not with the intro and all that kind of stuff, but I want to start with chapter 3, right? So chapter 3 is on phenomenology. And phenomenology, as I said, was developed, especially by this great philosopher Edmund Husserl in his book called simply Ideas, and then reinterpreted by his student Martin Heidegger, who we sometimes call Voldemort, right, in a more refined way. And we talked about both of those ways and the ethical implications of how we describe what we see and how we view our neighbors, right? We can view them in an objectifying way, or we can view them in this more phenomenological way. But let's just talk about the phenomenological method, right? So what is the phenomenological method? Well, step 0 is to draw a circle, right? Step 1 is to vaguely identify this thing itself, right? The thing itself. So identify whatever it is, right? It could be gender, right? We could say, all right, let's talk about gender and the difference between sex and gender. Or we could talk about race, right? The difference between race as a social construct versus genetics or, that sort of thing, biology. Or we could talk about justice, right? So the relationship between justice and injustice and that sort of thing. We could talk about rights or anything we could put in the center, right? We started by putting a simple die at the center of the circle and trying to see this die from various perspectives, understanding the limitations of one's perspective, right? The view from nowhere does not exist, and the view from everywhere is impossible. Therefore, we've got to recognize our situatedness, our perspectival starting point, right? So then that's the next step. Step 0, draw a circle. Step 1, vaguely identify this thing that we're talking about. Then step 2, begin to describe the phenomenon, right? So the phenomenon is that which appears to the conscious mind. Whose conscious mind? Mine. It's always mine, right? It's always mine. No matter who you are, it's mine, right? My perspective. So the phenomenon appears to my conscious mind, right? But my conscious mind is some place at some time. The view from nowhere does not exist. The view from everywhere is impossible. The view from where I stand is only available to me. The view from where I stand is only available to me. The phenomenon is in my head. Phenomenon is that which appears to the conscious mind. It's not the thing itself, but it's the thing itself as it appears to my conscious mind, right? So then step 1 would be to describe the phenomenon. Maybe I should just put step 1, describe the phenomenon, right? That which the thing itself as it appears to your conscious mind. So this is what you should be doing in your podcast episodes, right? Every podcast, come in with a plan. Who's going to go first? Who's going to go second? All that kind of stuff. Whoever's going to go first, they begin by saying, here's the thing I wanted to talk about that comes from this lecture on this day. And Brad said this. I want to talk about that. Here's how I understand it. Describe the phenomenon as you see it, right? The phenomenon, which appears to your conscious mind. Tell us where you're coming from, right? So in other words, what anchors your perspective? So, and then step 3 is to listen, right? So you're describing to your neighbors we could draw more lines, as many points, right? So we're describing to our neighbors what we see, and that is our knowledge, passing our rational knowledge from person to person. What makes it rational? What makes it rational is that we're following Aristotle's rules of logic, which we did in chapter 6, right? So the most important rule of logic is to clearly define your terms, and rational knowing is inherently binary, right? It's either A or not A. If you've defined your terms clearly, then you know exactly what you mean when you use that word. And then it's just a matter of getting other people to understand what you mean and recognizing that other people may use that word in a different way. So then the discourse is about refining how we understand these fundamental terms, right? So rational knowledge is always going to be a discourse, a back and forth, a discussion. Well, I think the word means this, and this is how I understand it, because this is what anchors my knowledge. And then listening to your neighbor in the same way. That's why Socrates called philosophy as a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect, which it does by refining our rational knowledge, which we have, so that's what your discussions are in your podcast, is a discussion articulating your understanding of the phenomenon of the thing that we're talking about, right? And articulating that in a way that's clear and rational so that your neighbor can understand it. And your neighbor's going to echo back and say, well, I understand it in a different way, which then helps us to refine the binary of these terms, right? But binary way of knowing is not the only way of knowing, right? We talked about in chapter 2 on epistemology, these various ways of knowing, right? So intellectual ways of knowing. So intellectual knowing, rational knowing, sensual knowing, imaginative knowing. And as I said at that point, we put these in a particular order because of where it comes from. So it comes from Socrates' divided line from book 6 of the Republic, and then book 7, which we're going to look at soon, right, is the famous allegory of the cave. And it's important for us to understand the allegory of the cave, and to do so, we'll need to understand these various ways of knowing, which, are ways of liberating us into free thinking, so we can think for ourselves independent of others and be confident in what we know, right, which then helps us to tackle our anxiety in this world filled with anxiety, right? Step 0, draw a circle. Step 1, vaguely identify the thing itself. Step 2, describe the phenomenon in your own terms, right, as you've understood it, using the most rational knowledge that you've had, but then recognizing that what we learned in chapter 2, right, on epistemology. So for your exam, you'll need to define epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, but more specifically, it's asking the question, what does our knowledge stand on, right? Episteme, what does our knowledge stand on, right? What does our knowledge stand on? And for now, let's just call that an anchor, right? So what anchors our knowledge? And just to give a quick review, right, we looked at some philosophers and how they answer the question. We looked at René Descartes. And Descartes said, well, so the question is, what anchors our knowledge? What anchors our knowledge? And Descartes said, well, the knower anchors the knowledge. Right. So René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. I can doubt the existence of everything in the world. I can doubt even the existence of my own body. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat, right? I can doubt the existence of everything, but I can't exist the fact that I am doubting. So there is this knower that is always there, that is the I, right? So the I, the knower, is what anchors knowledge. So in chapter 5, we talked about the first principles of knowledge, right? That's kind of what we're talking about now. But but we also describe these as anthropology, cosmology, and existentialism, right? So who am I, where am I, and why am I here? So Descartes wants to anchor our knowledge in that who am I, in that anthropology, right? So who am I, that becomes the anchor for the other three, right? So it's not existentialism and it's not cosmology, but it's anthropology, right? This knower is what anchors our knowledge. But then David Hume comes around and says, no, that's not the case, right? This knower constantly changes. Every time the knower knows something new, the knower is different. And the knower, right? Knower and knowledge are subject and object. They're constantly changing, right? It's like polars. You can't have a top without a bottom. You can't have a knower without knowledge. They're mutually constitutive correlates. You can't have one without the other. And so as knowledge changes, so too does the knower. And as the knower changes, so too what is known, right? So that can't be the anchor, right? So Descartes says the knower is the anchor. Hume says, nope, it's not. And then we get Immanuel Kant come around, and Kant says, well, we need an anchor. We cannot have knowledge unless it is anchored in something, right? We need an anchor. Otherwise, we're just in a relative world where nothing matters, nothing means anything, and we wind up in nihilism, right? A relativistic nihilism where we can't know anything and it's just what you believe is all that matters, right? Then in a world where nothing means anything, then it's just a matter of belief and opinion. And Kant said that's not good for society, right? If we have a society governed by opinions and, that's not grounded in anything, then you just wind up with a chaotic society, and that's not good, right? Bad things happen. So in order to have a common ethics where everybody behaves well, you've got to have your knowledge anchored in something real, something solid, right? Something consistent that doesn't change. And Kant said, well, Descartes' given us a good enough answer. Let's go with his answer, even though Hume has kind of annihilated that answer, right? And it's just not exactly right. So then we looked at some other possibilities, right? So if we agree with Kant that we have to have an anchor, and we agree with Kant that we can't know what that anchor is because it's inherently unknowable, because whatever the basis of knowledge is must be the basis of knowledge, right? If it's knowable, then it becomes knowledge and therefore needs a basis. So, right, the source of the river is not the river. So the basis of knowledge, the foundation, well, the rock that the house is built on is different than the house, right? You need something underneath the house. That's why we pour foundations. We can make foundations now, but still, you get the point, right? Hopefully. Still, you got to build that foundation on, you can't build it on sand, right? You got to dig down to get some solid ground right? So this anchor that epistemology is searching for, we're still looking for it, right? So Kant said we really, really need it. We have to have it. Without it, we're lost. And so he puts it in the knower because he doesn't know where else to put it. He said we have to stipulate something, right? Let's stipulate something. And he said the knower. But that doesn't work for me. Maybe it doesn't work for you because Hume's already kind of shown us, like, right, the brain is hardware and the software running on that is constantly changing, right? Random access memory and all that kind of stuff. We're constantly in a state of motion. That's what it means to be, is to be in motion. We know that from physics, right? And a good metaphysics is always based on a good physics. Our metaphysics is only as good as our understanding of physics. So we need something to anchor it in. Kant said the knower doesn't work for me. And so let's look for some other possibilities. Well, let's go back to systematic philosophy, right? What we covered in chapter 1, systematic philosophy. But we've been covering it all semester 2, right? I'm not going to erase anything. Okay, so we've got ontology at the center. And then we've got epistemology. Epistemology and language, one circle out. And then we've got logic, desire, and aesthetics. on the outside. Then we've got the first principles of philosophy, right? So existentialism / theology. Why? Because they're not the same thing, but they can perform similar functions. And there's definitely plenty of overlap between them. Cosmology, or study of the world, right? We could put pretty much all natural sciences there, right? Maybe some social sciences too. The study of the world around us, right? What is the world around us? The study of the world, that's cosmology. And then anthropology. That's terrible. It's really hard to write that way. Right. So this is what we mean by systematic philosophy. So anytime we're going to approach any sort of question, right, what does it mean to be, what is gender, right? Then we want to try and approach gender from as many different angles as possible, right? Trying to understand the relationship between gender and sex, right, or biology and genetics, or right, trying to understand what is the being of gender. Is gender just something, a product of language that's made up by rational binary thinking that needs those sort of distinctions? Or, so let's try and think about things in a systematic way, right? So we're not leaving this kind of chart. Systematic philosophy helps us to, like, okay, wait, we've approached this question from this direction, but what if we think about the same question from this other direction, which is also pretty valid, right? So let's think about it in all these different ways. And then that gives us at least some assurance or some confidence that we're like considering it from a lot of different angles. It may not be all the anger. That was always going to be more that we're missing, but this is a systematic approach to asking questions so that we can kind of, all right, let's think about it from this angle, from this angle, from this angle, right? Even if you're just analyzing a movie, maybe you're a film major, right, or something like that, and you're trying to analyze a movie. Maybe you're thinking about it in terms of like, well, what is the character developments, right? And how are the characters' development, and how do we understand this person's motivations, and can we see the world from their perspective, right? Anthropology. What is this world that they're living in, right? Is it a futuristic world where like imagining this world, or this, this situation, whether you're talking about Lord of the Rings or, Minority Report or something set in modern day, right? How is it painting the picture of the world? And then, so those bigger existential questions. What's the meaning or purpose of life that's conveyed through the movie? But we also think about it in terms of like logic and desire. Like, does it make us think in a particular way, or does it make us feel a particular way? What about the aesthetics? What about the music, the cinematography, the lighting, right? So we can think about just about anything in this using this systematic approach, right? So we're just trying to use this is a tool to help us to think clearly and to have good discourse with one another, so that, anything on this circle, this systematic philosophy, can help us to think about things in a different way, right? But let's go back to the question at hand, right? What anchors our knowledge? So we saw Descartes tried to anchor it here in anthropology, but Hume says, well, that doesn't work because the world is constantly changing. And these kind of anthropology, our study of ourselves and our study of the world, those are kind of like knowing knowledge. That's what, it changes. That's the nature of being, is to be in a state of confidence. It can't be our anchor, right? And then Kant says, well, we need an anchor, so let's just choose that, right? And then other people might say, well, we need an anchor, so let's choose something from science. But, problems with both of those. It's the same problem either way. But then the question is, well, can we find some third thing, right? Some other thing, something that's not knower or knowledge, but something static, something that doesn't change, right? Something that is fixed, something that is unchanging, right? And well, maybe we haven't found something yet, and Kant gives us, pretty convincing evidence that we're not going to find it, where we can't find it. It's not findable. It's not knowledge. It can't count as knowledge. But what if there's some other thing, right? And so then we looked way back to this other philosopher named Plotinus. And so Plotinus gives us an answer, right? And the reason that was in that chapter on first principles of knowledge is because we're trying to find an anchor, right? And so Descartes tried to put it here. Hume said you can't. But if we look way back to Plotinus, he gave us another possibility. He said, what if we do not philosophy but theology? And he gives us sort of elements of theology with Proclus through and building on Plotinus, right? Said, what if we choose this particular canon of texts, right? We need a canon of texts. Right, so if we want to ask these questions, let's anchor it here in theology by choosing a body of text, and let's make those sacred, or sacred literally means that which is set apart from the other kind of text, right? There are different kind of texts. These are set apart, and they're set apart, specifically to be an anchor for the discourse, so that our anchors then are not here, but instead our anchors begin to shift, right? We need to lift our anchors and to shift them to this body of text, right? That way, the text, what's the advantage? Well, all right, so let's put Plotinus in context again. Remember, Plotinus was around 300, like 3rd century CE, right? Had taken over the academy in this long line of succession that started with Plato, right? Back in 300s BC, right? So long period of time in between them. And Plotinus was like, we haven't really made much progress. There's like Plato and then Aristotle and then, I don't know, a whole bunch of chumps, right? And Plotinus says, maybe the reason we aren't making much progress in philosophy is because we got to look back at this canon of texts, right? And let's go back to Plato's writings and let's use that body of text, which is fixed. It doesn't change. So we can argue whatever we want to argue. Still plenty of room for differing perspectives, right? We're not limiting perspectives per se, right? But let's let these texts be our anchor so that we can have meaningful discourse with a common set of terms and a common set of material that we can all discuss. So, we could think about what do we think of that solution? Seems like a good solution to me, right? So then we set this body of texts as a canon, knowing that we've kind of like stipulated these texts, right? Because they work for this purpose and they can anchor our discourse. And then we can have, a system of knowledge built upon that anchor. But then the problem is, of course, what? How do we choose that canon? How do we pick what texts go into that canon? So Plotinus said, hey, let's just use the dialogues of Plato. Well, you know what? Dialogues of Plato are pretty good. Definitely. I'd be on board with including those in the canon. I'd be an advocate of that, in fact. But there's a lot of other things out there, right? What do we put in the canon? What do we leave out? How do we make decisions? I'm not sure that our society in 2022 can do that, right? But nevertheless, as Kant has shown, we need to do that, right? Otherwise, we just end up in a chaotic society where people are talking past each other, right? And aren't making any real progress, right? As Plotinus saw, the philosophers of his day weren't making any progress and the society was crumbling around him, right? Because the society had no sort of common philosophical direction to say, what are we doing, right? Why are we here? What are we here to do? What sort of world are we trying to create, right? For that, you need some sort of direction or something to anchor the community. And so what sort of text could we use? And I think, in the second half of the course, let's start to investigate that question a lot. And we're going to have to pick some particular texts, which are going to anchor our discourse, right? So one of the first ones we're going to choose is Plato's Phaedrus dialogue. So we'll look at that and let that text anchor our discourse. We can talk about lots of things like Socrates gives us a really clear definition of what he means by soul, right? And so talks about soul and body and mind and spirit, So we can use those texts as a way to sort of anchor our discussion. But then we need to think about what texts should we include, what to exclude. So we're going to do Phaedrus, but we're going to do some other things too, right? We might look at Luke chapter 13 from the Christian New Testament. We might look at we might look at Harry Potter and maybe some contemporary things, contemporary media, right, that are more part of our common discourse, right? Harry Potter is something that most people in our society know pretty well, so it becomes a good anchor for our discourse, right? So we can think about anchors. The nice thing about anchors is that they are kind of portable, right? So you can pick them up and put them back down. Now, I want to go back to tie in a couple more pieces. One of the pieces comes again from our chapter on epistemology. And so in epistemology section, it talks about that we know through comparative relation, right? So we know one thing in comparison to things that we already know, right? This idea comes from a philosopher named Nicholas of Cusa. We know through comparative relation. So in other words, if we think about the development of the human mind, particularly, an infant, an infant, right? Or somebody, an early stage toddler, right? When children are just beginning to learn language, then they learn those most important archetypes, mama and daddy, right? And then brother and sister and those sort of things, right? They learn about their environment, but then they begin to learn things that are more from the world, right? So archetypes, like the example I gave before was my niece learning the word wolf, right? So she learns wolf, and wolf becomes an archetype for experiencing new things. And then she sees something else, and she looks at it and says, oh, that's a wolf, right? Because a wolf is something 4 legs, covered in fur, with cute little ears and a tail, right? So, and then she sees something else with covered in fur, 4 legs, cute little ears, and a tail, and says, well, that's a wolf. And then mom and dad say, no, that's a cat, right? Cat's different than a wolf. But we see why you've understood, right? So this is just how humans learn. Humans learn through what Nicholas of Cusa calls comparative relation. All right, so dog, and then various breeds of dog, and right, we could go on. But the point is we learn from particular archetypes which anchor our systems of learning, right? And then so those primary archetypes that we learn as an infant and toddler then shape how we understand and learn everything around us, right? And so we learn lots of archetypes from our parents and from our Sunday school teachers and from our, teachers at school and nursery leaders and friends and neighbors, and right, we learn archetypes from all around us, from our world as we're growing up, and then that shapes how we learn and receive everything else, right? So these sort of anchors are innate in us, right? And it's particularly when, when a young person goes off to college, then, right, they're very anchored in that that way of knowing, right? And then they enter a new world, right, where they become somewhat unmoored from home, where they pick up their anchor and move to a new place in a very real way, right? And then begin to learn new things and specialize. And one of the groups, one of the students in this group of podcasts said, that was such a big thing for her, is recognizing that in high school, we all learn the same thing. Everybody's learning the same thing. We're taking the same classes and have the same expectations, same standardized tests, and we're learning the same thing. We're learning how to think alike. We're learning how to be the same. And then you go off to college, and then you begin specializing in this, majoring in this, right? And then you get an expertise in this or that. Of course, it's different for vocational schools because they're also specializing in that knowledge earlier on too. But the point being that you recognize that people around you have specialties and specialized knowledge that you don't have, and you have specialized knowledge that they don't have, right? And so then that becomes an opportunity for rational discourse so that we can share that knowledge with one another and then learn from one another, because we have differing bases or anchors of knowledge, because we come from differing majors or differing disciplines, right? We come at this perspective from cosmetological perspective, or we come at this from HVAC perspective, or we come at this from a nurse's perspective, or a teacher's perspective, or game design perspective, right? So we're coming at the world from differing perspectives, and if we lift our anchors and then can find some common anchor that we can say, hey, let's talk about this, let's put that at the center of the circle, then we can, the discourse becomes all the more productive, because then we've got a common set of terms and things that we can talk about, right? So everything kind of revolves around this anchor, right? So epistemology, what anchors our knowledge? Descartes said it's in the knower. Hume said, no, it's not. Kant said, we really need one. And then Plotinus, Plotinus is way back before all the rest, but Plotinus said, well, what if we put this in a common set of texts, right? As long as this community has a common set of texts that they can all, talk about, if it's a constitution or Bill of Rights or something like that, then that common set of texts can be something that anchors the community, and they can argue at whatever perspective they want, but it needs to be grounded in interpretations of that text, which doesn't change, right? Which then can anchor and form a sense of cohesiveness that can make discourse more productive. So one other thing that I want to include in this review, I can't cover everything that we've covered in the course, but you've already had some really good discussions on death, but I want to draw again to an important point that I made in chapter 4 that may have gotten overlooked because it's kind of at the end, and so your mind's tired, and I save the most important stuff for last when everybody's too tired to get it. That's a problem of mine. But there's a relationship. We need to recognize the relationship between intercourse and discourse, right? Intercourse is passing a seed into an egg, which then creates a new being, right? So it's a new creation that comes out of the combination of sperm and egg, right? That's intercourse and insemination. But discourse is not all that different, right? Discourse is not an exchange of physical bodily fluids, right? But it is an exchange of ideas, which becomes seeds of knowledge and seeds of wisdom, which gets planted in this other person who comes from a different background and has a different anchor and sees the world from a different place, right? Because the view from nowhere does not exist. So the view from everywhere is impossible. But this person's viewpoint is unique in such a way that only this person knows their perspective. So if I give them this idea, then that idea is going to sound different from their perspective, which then gives me more and more information or knowledge about the truth of that idea, so I can find out what is the truth of this thing or come closer to it through that discourse with somebody else who comes from a different background and therefore has a different anchor. But that only kind of works if we begin to anchor our discourse in something else. But the point that I was trying to make a second ago is that, right, these seeds of knowledge get planted in the minds of those around us with whom we're in discourse, but they grow, and they grow in a different way, right? So it's not just in the same way that intercourse leads to a creative act, right? So death is an end, sex is a creation, a newness, a beginning, right? So death is an end, sex is a beginning. And so as long as you have sex before the end, then, there's something to continue. Don't worry, we got enough people, so we'll be fine. But that's what sex is the beginning of something new. Likewise, discourse is the beginning of something new. So this idea, this rational knowledge that I share with you, when those seeds of knowledge gets planted in your mind, they're going to take root and be something new. That's not quite what I taught you or told you, and definitely not what you knew before, right? But something new that grows. And then so when I listen in turn to your perspective by hearing one another into speech, then then it's sort of like those seeds of knowledge grow and enrich everyone in this ecosystem of discourse around us, right? Cool. Okay. Another couple of things that we covered in this intro, but may have gone by quickly. Yeah, I only covered it very quickly. I've mentioned it a few times, but always just like, oh, and also this. So I'm going to do it again here as, oh, and also this, because it's such an important part of the content, but we haven't really gotten to it as much, but we still need that piece right now, even though we're going to talk about that piece more later. And that said, you know, in order to be a human person, human persons have these various aspects to being a human person, right? We are bodies. We also are minds, right? And then we're also spirits and soul, right? So you can't really be a human person. To be a human person is to have a body, right? Every human person I've known, they got a body, right? Or they are their bodies, but their bodies are with them, right? And so if you come to my class and I mark you absent, but you say my mind was there, but my body wasn't, well, body's got to be there, right? So bodies as part of being human, but when I die, like if I were drop dead now, my body would still be here, but my mind wouldn't, right? So mind is something different than bodies. In terms of soul, we'll come back to that when we get to Plato's Phaedrus dialogue, because Socrates in there gives a really clear, logical definition of the word soul. So we can read his definition and say, yeah, that's definitely what I mean by soul, or well, I never thought about that before, or we can talk about it, right? But we're going to put that at the center of the circle, taking Plotinus's point of saying, hey, let's start with a text, and how about this good text that gives us a definition of soul, and then we can think about whether or not we agree with it or not, or whether it's consistent with our anchors of knowledge that we've had beforehand or not. Right, so mind, body, soul, and spirit. So we've talked in the past about like Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King, his body is dead. It doesn't move anymore, right? It's dead. What about his mind? Well, his mind doesn't produce any more thoughts or ideas, but he did write a lot, right? And he did speak a lot. So those words and those ideas that come from his mind, those words and ideas are still here, right? So he's not creating new ones. So you could say his mind is kind of over, but it's also not completely dead, right? Hopefully, because if we read those words and ideas, then they can continue to have a life after the death of his body and mind. But then what about spirit, right? So then the spirit of Martin Luther King is maybe a spirit of unity, a spirit of nonviolence, a spirit of getting along, a spirit of, right, cooperation and all sorts of things. And so maybe that spirit can continue to live on insofar as it inspires other bodies who then put those ideas, or take those ideas of peace and harmony and nonviolence and those sort of things, and put them into action in and through their bodies. Then their bodies are inspired by the spirit of Martin Luther King, and therefore that continues on after death, right? So even as we're talking about something like death, we have to use these terms, right? We may understand these terms in different ways, and that's part of what we'll do later, is go into some more detail about what we mean by those terms. But nevertheless, anthropology is going to have to take into account all these different terms. And you may have noticed that I wrote them in a way that kind of corresponds to these various ways of knowing, right? To be a human is to have sensual knowledge, and we sense the world through our bodies. So to be a human person is to imagine and have different ideas, and maybe that's something that we mean by soul. And then rational knowledge is what that calculating, right, rational part of the mind that keeps us alive for so many, right, iterations and generations. But then something intellectual that causes us to, to be good people, or to choose the good over the bad, or whatever, right? So hopefully starting to see how all of these things tie together. And then Lastly, when I was talking about circles, right, I gave an ontology of circles, an ontology of music in the videos, an ontology of circles in the class, and maybe both of those were in the videos. Right, then we can think of the rational, like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, written down. It's rational knowledge, right? The sensual aspect of it is something you can only hear and feel in the moment. Intellectual idea of beauty or something like that is a different way for the music to, or harmony is a different way for the music to exist, right? So anyway, the point being that as we gather these tools and think about various ways for things to exist or various ways of being, we see that they also correspond with various ways of knowing, and they also correspond with various aspects of what it means to be human. So the relationship between these things, these first principles of philosophy, are always inherently and inextricably linked. And right now, I hear my kids coming in the door, so I'm going to wrap up this this review. And hopefully it made some sense and put some pieces together for you, and covered. I think the best way to prepare for the exam is go through the questions that are in the syllabus. But hopefully all of those questions I answered in one way or another here. Anyway, look forward to it, and peace out.